Are they slow moving, Chief?
Yeah, they're dead. They're all messed up.
Please, my son is trapped. 887 White Beach Lane. Someone get to 887 White Beach Lane.
In a moment, they're going to send a man down 30 fathoms and check on a noisemaker. Someone or something tapping on metal.
Anything Ghost, number 315. The Anything Ghost Mega-Macabre Halloween Special. Happy Halloween season, and welcome to Anything Ghost. I'm Lex Wahl. Anything Ghost is a podcast where listeners, like you, send in their true experiences with ghosts or local ghost legends, and I read them to you. Or, sometimes, the listeners record their own stories. We'll have some of both in this episode. Plus, I have some true ghost stories from long ago that were in the news. This is the 18th episode for the Halloween special, the Mega-Macabre Halloween special. I hope you enjoy it. But you're here for the ghost stories, so let's pack it up and move it out. Well, actually, maybe I'll check with my Ouija board first. Should we begin with the true ghost stories now? And here we go. The first story is from Henry in the U.S., The Ghost of a Friend. Strange things happened when my uncle's mother passed away in Costa Rica. Within minutes of her death, eerie experiences rippled through the family, crossing borders and time zones. For context, my uncle's mother was elderly, bedridden for months, and everyone knew her time was drawing near. Still, no one could have predicted what followed. It started with my uncle. He was the caretaker of a church in New York, living on the property. That day, as he prepared for church, he was alone, setting up about 30 minutes early. The silence inside the vast, dimly lit sanctuary was heavy. As he lit the altar candles, he suddenly heard footsteps behind him. His breath caught. He turned, expecting to see someone, but the church was empty. Shaking it off, he returned to his task, only to hear the footsteps again, closer this time, like someone creeping up on him. He spun around. Nobody there. Then, without warning, a gust of cold wind swept through the altar, snuffing out the candles he had just lit. A chill crawled up his spine as a single thought entered his mind. Mom. Panicked, he hurried back to his quarters, grabbed the phone, and dialed his sister in Costa Rica. The moment she picked up, her voice trembled with the words, "Mom just died. Mom just died." "2,000 miles away, his younger sister had just received the news too. She sat sobbing on her bed when, out of nowhere, she felt the mattress beside her sink, as though someone had sat down. Her breath hitched. In her heart, she knew it was their mother. She was there to comfort her one last time. The unsettling experiences swept through the family, one after another. But my grandmother's encounter was the most chilling. As in-laws, my grandmother and my uncle's mother had been close, living just blocks apart. Every Sunday they shared coffee and conversation. But with her friend now gravely ill, my grandmother had been waiting for the worst. It was on one of these Sundays, at their usual coffee hour, that things took a terrifying turn. That afternoon, as usual, my grandmother brewed her coffee. The small kitchen filling with the familiar aroma. It was a tight space, with one narrow door leading in and out, and a small table next to the doorway. With the mug in hand, she turned from the counter to head toward the table, and froze. There, sitting at the kitchen table by the doorway, was her friend. She looked just as she had on those Sundays before the illness. A frail but smiling presence, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that wasn't there. My grandmother's heart raced. She knew it was impossible. Her friend had been bedridden for months. The coffee mug slipped from her trembling hand, shattering on the floor. And yet, there she sat, smiling, and was speaking. But her lips moved in silence, like a muted scene on television. Panic surged through my grandmother's body. She wanted to scream, to move, but felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear. Then, with a rush of instinct, she bolted past the figure, her chest tight with terror. She didn't stop running until she reached the living room. She looked back, half expecting the specter to follow, but the doorway to the kitchen remained empty. Shaking and grasping for air, she collapsed into a chair, her eyes fixed on the kitchen, waiting, terrified of what might come next. Just then my cousin, who lived with my grandmother, walked in. She found my grandmother pale, crying and pointing at the kitchen, barely able to speak. All she could manage to say was, "She's here, in the kitchen." Fearing an intruder, my cousin grabbed a heavy object and cautiously made her way into the kitchen. But when she looked, it was empty. No one was there. The house was searched, but nothing was out of place. My cousin returned to my grandmother, just as the phone rang. It was my uncle. His voice was heavy with grief, as he asked to pass along the news of his mother's death. But before she could say a word, my grandmother, still staring toward the kitchen, whispered, "I know. I already know. My friend has passed." And that was from Henry in the U.S., like I said. And that was, I think, one of the creepier visits from a friend, a ghost friend that we've ever had. But thanks for sending that in, Henry. And as I said, a lot of people record their own stories. At the beginning I said that. And I have several of them here, so I'm going to drop one in right here and now. And this one's from Dan in Bothel, Washington. It's a continuation of a ghost story. And here's Dan.
Greetings, Lex and my fellow Anything Ghost listeners. This is Dan from Bothel, and I'm here to tell you a true ghost story about the events of my life from December 2017 through December 2018. Now, this isn't the first time I've submitted a story to Anything Ghost. My first submission was 9 years ago, entitled Hot Air and a Whisper, for episode 210 in 2015. Going back to that episode and listening to what I said then, I cringed at my overly theatrical and campy storytelling. But I got to relive the memory of a night spent with my then fiancée Kristen and her whippet geisha. That is where this ghost story starts. And that night was part of the last peaceful and pleasant summer I would ever have, for reasons that will become apparent. I'm going to avoid using my prior style of storytelling and telling my ghost story to all of you tonight, as it'll make sense once we get into it. Listening to that past episode was bittersweet for me because I got to relive the memory of sleeping next to Kristen as she snored and being woken up by Geisha in her crate in the middle of the night to come and join us. The ghost whispering to me from that mass of hot air, in retrospect, was a harbinger of what was to come. The first to die was Geisha in March of 2016. Our sweet elderly whippet developed a slip disc that eventually threatened to sever her spinal cord. So Kristen and I had to put her down one warm spring afternoon that March. Chris and I were getting ready to be married that October and to purchase our first house together, and the loss of Geisha weighed heavily on us as we made our preparations. The next to die was Kristen in September of 2017. Unknown to either of us, she had developed a brain tumor, and it would be a lethal one. We got married in October of 2016, moved into our new home in December of 2016. And then in March of 2017, almost a year to the day after we lost Geisha, Kristen had a hemorrhagic stroke right in front of me and collapsed. She would die in my arms 6 months later, that Labor Day of 2017. As I held her and sang to her, making sure she knew she wasn't alone, she took her last breath and exhaled directly into my face. Now, in the years since, I've come across some folk stories and folk tales and various occult sources of knowledge that say it's a bad idea to stand in front of somebody's dying breath. The idea is that the departing soul can get entangled with the living soul in front of them. I suspect that is what happened to me, as from that day forward, I carried a weight and a sadness that was not my own, in addition to my own exceptional sorrow and grief. I could feel it in the months that followed, like a heavy, invisible blanket that separated me from the skies. The first supernatural experience came in December of 2017. I was alone in my new home, working in my office, and decided to get up and get a drink. Outside the door of my office is a long hallway leading to the kitchen, and as I entered that hallway, I paused, for somehow I sensed this immediate, visceral presence of a predatory being stalking toward me along the wall to my right. Though I could not physically see it, nor picture it in my mind's eye, I sensed that entity. It was somehow disregarding gravity, and it was moving towards me like a cougar stalking an unaware lamb. I'd never encountered anything so evil or malicious like that in my life, but I knew at a fundamental level it meant me harm. Behind me in my office was a portrait of a Chinese temple guardian dog, a particularly fearsome grown foo dog that I had purchased earlier that year at a craft show. The portrait resonated with me at the time, and somehow I felt that bringing this painting into my home would provide me with protection. Now, facing down an invisible, malevolent, vicious entity stalking me in my own home, I remembered the portrait and reached behind me to touch it. At the same time, in my own mind, I somehow knew to draw upon the meaning, the resonance of the foo dog, and make myself spiritually larger than what was approaching me. I did so, and the entity approaching me simply disappeared. One moment it was there filling my house with dread, and the next, gone. I spent the rest of that evening and night with all the lights in the house on, and I was still feeling that weight and sadness that wasn't my own. I wondered if somehow Kristen's soul was still stuck to mine, and if that was making us a target. I decided to start doing my research. In February of 2018, I traveled to Oahu, Hawaii, for a vacation that was supposed to be my honeymoon with Kristen. Only I took it alone as a way to try and let go of her. And while I was there, I heard of a place called Polly Lookout atop one of the mountain passes of the island, and how it was considered a thin place between the worlds. I got this idea to conduct a ritual there along with an offering in the hopes that somehow I could find a way to let go of Kristen and maybe lose this weight and sadness that had been smothering me. So one afternoon, an hour before the gates to the lookout were closed, I drove up to Polly Lookout in the hopes that I would be alone. And I was, because a pounding rainstorm and 40-mile-an-hour winds were lashing the island. I parked, got out of the car, got instantly soaked, and I had brought with me a bottle of whiskey, Maker's Mark, a plastic cup, and a paper containing a letter I'd written to Kristen. The rain was almost horizontal at the time, blowing northwest over the mountain pass from the outlying suburbs of Honolulu behind me to the shores of Waikea far below me on the edge of the outlook. There I poured an offering of the Maker's Mark whiskey to the guardians of the lookout and asked them to let me use the space to call out to Kristen. And then, in the driving rain, I sang the songs that I'd sung to Chris as she died and read from the paper in my hands. Then I released the paper to the winds and it fluttered off in the gray, stormy abyss beneath me. And at that moment, I heard Kristen's voice in my head yelling, "Dan, get out of the way!" And then the weight and the sadness were gone, never to return. The following evening was my last in Hawaii before returning to Seattle. I decided to go to the north end of Waikiki to a joint called Cheeseburger in Paradise. I don't know why I chose that location. It was kind of out of the way. I entered the restaurant and took a seat next to a woman my age, a local native Hawaiian woman, who was sitting there looking straight ahead, sipping a beer. In front of her was an untouched shot of whiskey. I made my order to the bartender and sat there in silence. So did the woman. And after a while, the silence became unbearable, and I felt compelled to ask her why she wasn't touching the shot of whiskey in front of her. She replied that she had no idea why she'd even ordered it. She lived in the condos above the restaurant and felt compelled this evening to come down and order a beer that she didn't normally like to drink and order a whiskey that she definitely didn't drink. The beer was a Mac and Jack's, and the whiskey was Maker's Mark, and both were my late wife's favorite drinks. I explained this to the woman, who was stunned. She asked me to tell her about my wife, and I told her that my wife's name was Kristen. Without a word, the woman pulled out her wallet and showed me her driver's license. Her name was Kristen, spelled the exact same way as my wife's. And she also worked as a mechanical engineer, which was my late wife's profession. We both sat stunned in silence by the synchronicity. I'd gotten my sign that my Kristen was okay. I paid for the woman's meal and wished her well. Never heard or saw from her again. But the story doesn't end here. 1 month later, in March of 2018, about the time that she had her stroke, I had this vivid dream of flying alone in a small airplane over a vast ocean. I didn't recognize the pilot flying the plane, and there was no co-pilot. He announced that we were going to land, and the plane landed at a rural airport in a country I didn't recognize. We walked from the tarmac into the terminal. From practice, I looked up at the departure screens to figure out where I was, and I remember seeing this vivid green symbol that my mind somehow interpreted as Zimbabwe, but I knew it wasn't actually the country. Rather, it was a symbol of an in-between place, a borderland where the normal rules didn't apply. There were people in the terminals waiting for their flights, including tour groups. One of those groups was led by a woman of terrifying presence, though she wasn't evil. And in that group was Kristen. She had a backpack on and was following the group when she saw me. She ran over to me and hugged me so hard I couldn't breathe. I was so happy to see her, but then I realized I couldn't breathe. I begged her to let go, but she hugged me harder and harder, and I began screaming her name. Then I woke up and realized that I had had an asthma attack and my lungs were in total vapor lock. I could not inhale at all. Knowing I only had moments before I passed out and died, I got up from the bed and staggered out to the kitchen where my work bag with my one asthma inhaler was. I grabbed the inhaler in time and managed to get my lungs to work again. Then, on the 1-year anniversary of Kristen's death, I was awoken from sleep by a woman's loud wail of grief in the middle of the night. It was a loud cry that rose up into a breaking wail and reverberated through my room before fading away into sobbing and then to silence. There was no one else in the house that night. It was not one of my cats, and nothing like that has ever happened again. Finally, in December of 2018, I felt Kristen's presence in my house. It literally felt as if she was just in the other room, as if all I had to do was walk down the hallway and stick my head into one of the bedrooms, and I'd find her there doing some chores. I did not see her, though I wanted to, nor did I hear her. But for 6 hours that day in December, I felt her in my house, Lex. It was literally just like sensing the presence of your spouse or your roommate or your sibling somewhere else in the house. That sense that you're not alone and it's a loved one. She was there that day, checking out what I'd done with the house, and then after 6 hours, that presence was suddenly gone. That was the last of the ghostly experiences I had with my late wife. She hasn't been a presence in my life since, though I still miss and love her to this day. I will not marry again. I am content with my life now, and I have found happiness. I do hope to eventually see her again on the day that I die. Thank you for letting me tell my story, Lex, and to you and all of the fellow Anything Ghost listeners, take care.
And thank you, Dan, in Bothel, Washington. The next story is from Victoria in Atlanta, Georgia. Visit from Ponchi. Hi, Lex. It always fascinated me how you have listeners that send it in multiple times. I never thought I would do that, but here I am. I first sent in my story back in January of 2023, I believe episode 300. This time I'll be talking about what I would like to believe was a visit from my grandfather, Mr. Thompson, or, as he asked us to call him, Panchi. Panchi was our unofficial, adopted grandfather. He is not either of my parents' parent, but he has been in our life for as long as I can remember. My father has had his own irrigation and lawn care business since I was about 5. I'm 29 now, so it's been a while. Panchi was one of my dad's first customers. They developed a very good relationship, and my dad eventually mentioned my mom, my siblings, and I. We eventually met Panchi, and we immediately clicked. We loved him, and he loved us. He would visit us every weekend. He would ask about our day and even bring us goodies like cookies or candies. And on weekends he was unable to come over, we would visit him. He would always say we were his grandchildren, and he would give us tight hugs when we said hi and bye. Unfortunately, my dad's parents didn't live in the U.S., and although my mom's parents did live in the U.S., they were very emotionally distant and serious. They were nice, but it was always, yes, sir, no, sir. We would never be able to joke around with them like we did with Panchi. With Panchi, it was different. We got to enjoy what I would say were the best experiences you can have growing up with a grandparent. This went on for years. He saw 2 more of my siblings join the family, birthdays, graduations. He even got to meet my husband when we first started dating. He was there through so many milestones, but he grew older, and it came a time when everything got a little harder for him to do. Then, April of 2022, he unfortunately passed away. If I remember correctly, he was in his early 90s. We went to his funeral, and it was a very touching ceremony. He was a Marine veteran, so he had a special ceremony. We couldn't help but cry, and one by one we said our goodbyes, telling him we'd miss him and loved him. He was cremated in a small mausoleum not too far from us. My husband actually has a friend that lives in the neighborhood across the street from that cemetery. My husband is usually over there at his friend's place Saturday afternoons, working on project cars with his friend. My husband is always eager to show his work and how it's going, so one of the times I went over there to hang around, I remember thinking I'd stop by and see Ponchi. It was probably the second time I was going alone to see Ponchi. I drove into the cemetery and parked outside the mausoleum. I'm usually not one to get spooked at cemeteries during the day, so I didn't think much of it. It's a small mausoleum, probably the size of a large living room, but once I got to the door and punched in the code to enter, I realized how cold and completely dark it was inside. There were lights the last time, and there was nothing to help prop the door open like there was the last visit. I let it get the better of me and stood there for a second. I decided to just hold the door open, and thankfully the sunlight let me see straight ahead. From that spot, I could see Ponchi's niche. I laughed and apologized, telling him, "I know it's probably silly to be scared, but I'll just say hi from the front door." I told him I missed him and wanted to say hi, and that I'm sorry I was too scared to fully go inside by myself. It was a quick, little visit. I closed the door and was on my way. That night was definitely not like any other night. Once my husband and our pups and I were all ready for bed, we said goodnight and fell asleep like usual. I tend to sleep facing away from the bed, and I don't usually wake up. But this night I woke up. It was all a bit visually blurry, but I remember it so clearly. I felt someone in front of me. I slowly opened my eyes, not in a scared to open them kind of way, but more like you do when you wake up and you're ready for the day type of way. I glanced up, and there was a figure probably 3 feet away from me. It had an outline of a person, but no specific features, just a shadow. I clearly heard it say, "Don't be scared. Turn around and go back to sleep." And that's exactly what I did. I closed my eyes, turned around, and I was now facing my husband and my little dog. I remember just getting comfy and falling right back to sleep like nothing. Once it was time to wake up, and there was sunlight, I shot up, and I remembered what I was thinking. What was that? To this day, it's burned in my mind. I wasn't scared. It was a warm, peaceful presence that felt so familiar. I immediately knew that it was Ponchi. He had made a quick visit to me to tell me not to be scared. My mom always mentioned that sometimes loved ones like to stop by or even show up in our dreams as a way of saying hi. I never thought I would be one of those lucky few that get to experience a loved one stopping by after they passed, especially because stuff like this never happens to me. It has been a while since that happened, but I've been meaning to share it for some time now. Have a safe and fun Halloween. And that was a story from Victoria in Atlanta, Georgia, about her grandpa Panchi and the creepy mausoleum. And next up is a story from Timothy in Jacksonville, Florida. Dinner Bell Time Warp.
Good day there, friend. I got some stories for you. I'm going to keep the locations private, some of them, just to seal some people's identities. Anyways, this first one starts out, I was on my grandparents' farm, and I went out in the evening time, out by their old barn. One of the barns was built in the 1800s. The other one was early 1900s. Now when I was standing out by the old dinner bell, and I saw somebody walking right between the barn and the garage building. And at first, I thought somebody was trespassing. And I said, "Grandpa?" Because I thought my grandpa might be out there. But the individual, they walked in there, and they stood kind of in the light, because there was a light out there. I could see him for a second. And when I was staring at him, I knew right then and there they were from another time. They weren't from our time. They had a hat, straw, and they're wearing a flannel, and they had suspenders on, boots. I couldn't see their face, I couldn't make it out, but I could see that the details, the clothing, because they're still in the shadows, and this was at dusk, so there's a little bit of sunlight out. The sun was just going all the way almost down, so you could see a little bit. And then they stopped and kind of stared at me for a second. I don't know if they were even really looking at me. And then they just turned and kept on walking. I was like, I'm going to catch this person, even though I knew it wasn't anybody I could catch. I went around the corner of the barn and they were gone. There's nowhere they could have gone. There's a fence there. There's no way they could have jumped it. I would have heard them. And I knew I saw a ghost. And I just tried to forget about it for a second there. I couldn't forget about it. I had goosebumps, I'm sure. I can't even remember. I just knew. I saw what I saw. All I could do is go back in the house. And I couldn't tell my grandma. She thought I was crazy. And I'm sure some people just thought, they would have thought I'd been making up stories. So that's my story. Now, my uncle told me a story just this past year. He moved into a house. It wasn't new. Somebody had lived there before, and I believe the lady had died in a nursing home or something, but she must have been drawn to the house. Anyways, he was sitting there in the evening watching his TV, minding his own, and he looked over and he thought for a second he saw somebody there, and it was just like mist. Then he just kind of forgot about it that evening. He's like, I'm just tired. He went to bed. Well, the next evening, he was sitting there watching TV again. He looked over, and that mist stuff kind of formed into what he thought he saw the night before, a woman in a nightgown. And she kind of looked over at him and said, he thought, yeah, I'm seeing a ghost. And then he said it carried on like that way for a number of nights. And then he never saw her again. So maybe she was coming to check on the house or something. See who was living there. I really don't know. Okay, So I have to say, my father's a minister, so he's got a number of stories from people over the years. This one, the first one, a woman was in the hospital and she was getting a surgery and she flatlined and she left her body and she was staring down at her body, saw the doctors and everybody working on her. Then she came back and she recounted all that, and so she had a near-death experience. Then another individual, he was in the military. I'm in the military too, so he told me this story. Well, he didn't exactly tell me, but he said he saw something. Then my father told me the story. So he was over in the Middle East, and it was war. There's combat going on. He was scared. But then he said he saw angels standing everywhere around him. He wasn't scared no more. So ever since then he's been a Christian. He believes in angels and everything, as Christians believe. Then a pastor, a different one, he had a deal with somebody at the church, and he said that they were having problems at their house, and he went there to bless it, and they had demonic activity going on there. The rocking chairs would rock by themselves, weird stuff like that. But he blessed it and did readings and stuff, and it stopped after that. Let's see, what's another one I got for you? Oh yeah, this one. There was a member at the church. He was an older gentleman, but he had worked for the police department his whole life. Well, not his whole life, but his whole career. He was a diver, and his job was to go out in the water and find dead bodies. He was really good at it. Come to find out, he told my dad one day after service, when he was shaking his hand, greeting him and saying goodbye, he told him that he saw ghosts. And I don't mean just a little bit. He saw ghosts all the time. He said that he saw this one individual at the church. He said that he wanted to tell my dad just because that individual's wife was standing by him, and she had died like the year before or so. Just wanted him to know that she was there with him. And he also said there was always a lady that was going up for communion. She's always trying to get it, and she couldn't get communion. She would go up every time. And I believe he saw other people there too as well. And I really believe it, because that church was built in like the 1930s, and it was eerie. I used to go there at night to practice guitar, and man, I heard stuff all the time. I'd hear like voices, and I'd always hear the side door close and somebody walking down the stairs, and I always thought it was like my dad or somebody coming in, the organist. And I'd always go over, and nobody would be there. And I'd get a feeling sometimes that I had to leave. Something didn't want, like, I wasn't supposed to be there, or I don't know. And I just got out of there. I had to leave. When I got that feeling, I had to leave. And my brother, and the organist, they were there one time. My brother was doing schoolwork. Actually, two of my brothers were there. They were both doing schoolwork, and the organist was there practicing, and they all went and were talking down below the balcony. And they looked up and they saw a lady up there in white. Or they saw it as white. And she went around and they saw her. And they went and followed, and they went up there and they couldn't find her anywhere. They were all freaking out. Oh yeah, another member asked my father to bust their house because they said they were seeing a little girl around their house, and their child had an imaginary friend, they said, but they said that they would see her and stuff. So so much for imaginary. Then this story is another one I ran into when I lived down in Miami. My wife and I got an apartment. We just had our daughter, little girl. And anyways, my wife was freaking out this one evening. And she said, "Come here." And I went over, and on the outside of our porch, which was screened in, like a balcony, there was little child's foot handprints. Little children handprints. And it couldn't have been my daughter. She's a baby. It was a girl probably like 6, 7, I don't know. Somewhere in that kind of age. They were on the outside of the window, and my wife was freaking out because we all knew her mom, and her had cleaned the whole apartment when we moved in, and there was nothing there. They'd cleaned that window really well. Sure enough, there was handprints. And then, when my wife's sister was there one time, she was with my daughter and just kind of hanging out, and a ball started just rolling across the room in like different directions, all by itself. And then on New Year's, I remember a number of years back, we were down there. We were looking for my daughter's toy. It was a little dog. This little dog rattle toy. We called it Perito. And we were looking all over for it. And it had been on the couch sitting right there. And I told my wife, I was like, I saw it right there. And she saw it. But it was gone. We were looking all over. I mean, we were just looking all over the place. And then we said, forget it, let's go, because we're going to her mom's. And we were leaving for the door, laying right in that exact spot where it had been. It was back there again. Then I remember I had this real bad dream this one night there, where I saw this woman trying to grab my daughter out of her crib. The woman just not right, like it was witchy. And I don't know, other stuff happened there too, and we just believed that somebody was messing with witchcraft around us or something, because people mess with some of that stuff around there in Miami, I know. But I guess that's everywhere. One of our neighbors or somebody had lived there before. But we had the house blessed and stuff, the apartment. So I don't know. I think that's all the stories I got for you right now. Hopefully that helps. Hey, you have a blessed one. And take care.
And as I alluded to at the beginning, I'm going to read some stories from decades ago. This first one is from Ghosts. I'm sorry, that's the title. But the first one is from 1923. And it was in California. Ghosts haunt drifts in California mine. Stories circulate here from time to time of ghosts in the underground workings of the Tintic Standard Mine. And the latest is that the specter of a child, dressed in white frock and white shoes, has appeared in the drifts deep in the bowels of the earth. The miner, as a rule, is a superstitious individual, and officials of the Tintic Standard scoff at the idea of spooks in their mine. On one recent occasion, miners came to the surface with reports that a ghost had been seen. Investigation developed nothing, and belief was expressed that what they really saw was one of their own, at work, clad only in his undergarments. An old Mexican miner of Eureka often tells of the time he and other workers saw a ghost of a small boy. It first appeared when the men were at lunch. Efforts to capture the specter were without result. Another ghost story revolves around a miner who was fatally injured while at work. This spook is described as a social disposition, for miners say it rides down in the cage and then disappears in the drifts. In an Oklahoma stope, several years ago, 13 miners died as a result of a cave-in. Survivors told of the apparition of a black dog which dashed back and forth, supposedly to warn the workers of an approaching danger. In connection with this disaster, there is supposed to be the specter of a woman, attired in black, who patrols the path from the scene of the mishap to the undertaking parlors where the bodies of the dead miners were taken. And again, that was an article from 1923. And here's another self-recorded story, and you might remember this next speaker from the previous episode. It's Franklin B., and he's going to tell us more stories, more odd stories from the Public Works Department.
You know, I gotta tell you folks, the more I think about it, the more I'm becoming convinced that this Hillview Public Works, oh, by the way, this is Franklin B. coming at you again with just another quick ghostish encounter. The Hillview Public Works has had a lot of just weird things that go on. People misplacing tools, and they swear that they're not there 1 minute only to come back in 10 minutes and there's the tool laying right where they looked 100 times. And other just strange things. I'd lost my jacket one time and was looking for it, couldn't find it. And I swear I looked on this chair 15 times that day where I sit, because I usually put it on the back of the chair. Well, I went out in the cold, it was a winter's day, and came back 1 hour later, and lo and behold, there's my coat right on the back of the chair, just like I left it. But you couldn't have convinced me that I was losing my mind, but in fact, maybe that's what's going on here. Who knows? But in any event, in recent weeks, reflecting back on my original story about Pete and Barnabas Collins, well, Pete came up to me a couple weeks ago and told me that he was there either late night, early morning, no one else was there, and he swears he heard somebody say, "Hey, Pete," expecting to be one of his co-workers, and looked behind him, looked all around, and just like before, looked out in the parking lot. Nobody was there other than him, but Pete swears that somebody called his name. Well, last week also, I usually get to work about an hour, maybe sometimes 2 hours earlier than I'm supposed to. Sometimes I'm there at 5 o'clock in the morning. First one there. Well, this other gentleman from another department that works in the same building, well, he usually shows up about the same time as me. And I thought, sure as the day is bright, that he was there, because I swear I heard somebody opening and closing the refrigerator door in our little kitchenette and rummaging around. I thought, well, Oscar's here already. But when I walked through the door down the hallway and looked at his office, the light was still off, thinking, well, maybe he just hadn't went to the office yet, stopped at the refrigerator or the break room. Well, I went to our office. It was a few doors down. Sat there and did a little bit of monkeying around on the computer. And about I'd say an hour, 45 minutes, an hour later, in comes Oscar from the normal door he usually opens and comes in from. And he says, "Good morning, Franklin." I said, "Well, good morning, Oscar." It's like, well, I didn't think, Oscar had just gotten there. And it's like, well, who in the world was in the break room there? I know there's not another soul in the place because everything else was dark. So maybe there was some kind of floating spirit trying to get something to eat, or who knows. But in any event, my cousin, thinking of ghostly stories, she had a lot of weird ghost story type things happen to her over the years. I think she's one of these sensitive intuitives or what have you, because years ago she was involved in the Springfield Ghost Hunter Society, they called it. They were a group of people that went around sort of like that old Ghost Hunters program with the Roto-Rooter guys. I don't know if anybody remembers the show, but they used to try to get EVPs, or whatever they call those, disembodied voices on recordings, and tried to get heat signatures on video of ghosts and supposedly haunted places. But in any event, she lived in an old house outside of Springfield there. And she had all kinds of ghostly things happening at her house. Her and her husband would be asleep, and only like at 2 o'clock in the morning hear just a loud, blood-curdling scream coming out of the living room. And they'd rush to the living room, nobody there, nobody around, and only 2 of them live in the house, except their 2 young children. But it wasn't the children's voice. They swear it was the sound of an old woman screaming. Or other stories she tells of like seeing a dog that actually was sort of half invisible walking through the walls, and a little boy out by the woods in old pioneer type clothing just vanishing before her eyes and things like that. But I went to visit her one time, years ago, me and a friend of mine, and she was telling us how one of the head of this Ghost Hunter Society came through her house, was doing a reading, sort of like that old woman on the Poltergeist movie that was there looking for spirits and what have you, the Amityville Horror or whatever. She said that a certain room was always ice cold at the end of their hallway, and a dark energy or a dark figure occupied this space. Well, I wanted to see this room, so her kids were there with us. They went down the hall to the kitchen to the right, and I knew they were in the kitchen. She was telling this story about the dark energy. The dogs that they had at the time would go in any room in the house, but for some weird reason, these dogs would never go in that one room that this lady said the dark energy was in. So the dogs were nowhere near the room, but we were all standing in this room. And I heard at the end of the hallway across from the kitchen was their front door, and I clearly heard the door open and slam shut. And I was absolutely waiting. Me and my friend were looking down the hall waiting to see who just walked in. Well, nobody walked in, and I looked at my cousin's husband, and I was like, do your neighbors just open and close the door and come in and say please around here? And it's like, nobody pulled up in the driveway. And it's like, no. And it's like, well, it must have been one of the kids. But as soon as I thought that, the kids came out of the kitchen on the other side of the hallway. So it must have been that dark energy causing this door to open and close, because you could clearly hear the doorknob being turned and opened, but no one entered or left the door. But that's just a little side story ahead, and the continuing story of the Hillview Public Works is still a work in progress. I will let you all know if anything further happens, in which case I'll send you the file with the story. And in the meantime, I have other stories that are semi-related to ghosts, but in a sort of a different light. I call them synchronicities, things very uncanny, unexplainable. Synchronicities happen to me like all the time, just out of nowhere. There's absolutely no explanation for the coincidental goings-ons, and I will send a couple of files and stories on those if your listeners would like to hear them. They might be interested in those as well. I will add those in another file. Enjoy your Friday the 13th, 2024.
And thank you, Frank, for recording that story and sending it in for the Halloween special of Anything Ghost. And as I said, this is the 18th annual Anything Ghost episode for Halloween. And I started calling it the Mega-Macabre Halloween special, even though it's not really macabre. But it is that. And if you want access to every single Halloween episode and every episode of Anything Ghost and then some, then you need to check out the Anything Ghost VIP group. Go to anythingghost.com, join VIP for more information. Anythingghost.com, join VIP for 18 years of Anything Ghost. This next story is from Bill in Ontario, Canada. And he sent a photo along with it that I'll have up on the website, anythingghost.com. Or if you're in the VIP group, it'll be on that website. Happy Halloween, Lex. Oh, it's called Picture in Salem. Happy Halloween, Lex. I'm a new listener and hoping Santa will give me the VIP membership for Christmas. I have a tale to tell. My family and I were on our way home to Canada this summer, and we stopped in Salem, Massachusetts. We booked an evening tour to escape the heat. The tour guide did a great job walking us through Salem and explaining the witch trials and the importance of many of the historic buildings. We stopped at the Ropes Mansion, which was closed, but we could tour the grounds and the lovely 19th century garden. I snapped a few photos with my phone as we left, and then we continued on with the tour. Hours later, we returned to the hotel, and we got the kids settled in. My wife went to bed. I then took the dog for a walk, and then got ready for bed. I wasn't tired, so I downloaded and looked through the photos I took. As I stared at the Ropes Mansion photo, I thought I could see something in the window. As I magnified the image, I began to see a ghostly figure staring out. It sent a cold chill down my spine. I've sent the picture so your listeners and you can see it and judge for yourselves. But it looks to me as if we were being watched from the window as we left. I recalled the tour guide saying the lights were on, which was unusual, and how the mansion was supposedly haunted by Abigail Ropes, who died from burns. and other spirits. What was curious was that people walked to the windows and looked in and said nothing. And I saw nothing as we walked away that night. I returned the next day, but the shades had been drawn, and the building was closed until the weekend. From ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties and things that go bump in the night, may the good Lord deliver us. Happy Halloween, Lex and listeners. Take care. All right, thank you again, Bill, in Ontario. And I'll post that picture with this episode at anythingghost.com or the VIP group, if you're a member. Up next, we have a story from Bob in the U.S., The Tapping Ghost and a Ghost in the Dark. The Tapping Ghost. It's October, and the cool wind blows against my face as leaves fall from trees. This time of year always brings back a chilling memory. It has been years since this happened, but it feels like just yesterday. I had just started a new job as a technical writer in an old building on the Southern California coast. The halls had shiny tile floors, common in old buildings. My shoes would click on the surface as I walked down the long, deserted hall to my office door. My office door was always closed and locked, as were all the doors on the same floor. As I entered, the old key squeaked in the lock, and the sturdy door creaked open. My cubicle was nested back and off to the right, surrounded by tall walls that concealed it entirely. You couldn't see anyone approaching. My job required intense concentration on editing documents. One day, as I was deeply focused, I heard a loud tap, like a pen striking my desk. One loud, sharp tap that echoed in the empty office. I looked up, expecting to see my supervisor, but no one was there. I questioned if I had imagined it. About 10 minutes later, it happened again. One loud tap, echoing through the room. I looked around. Still no one. I stepped outside my cubicle and found the hall deserted. I was sure of one thing. I had not imagined it. So, what could be causing it? It happened 2 more times that day. Each time, I would get up to check and find nothing, leaving me more unsettled each time. I told my supervisor and some colleagues about it. They looked at me, smiling, shaking their heads. They didn't believe me. It only happened when I was alone. A month later, I was transferred to another location and was relieved that the new place didn't have the tapping ghost. I wonder sometimes if the person who works in my old spot has experienced the same thing. A loud tap that echoed through the office, recurring and haunting. What could it have been? Perhaps the ghost of a former employee wanting to scare me or get my attention. We will never know. Perhaps the tapping ghost will visit you sometime. I've always loved this time of year, as the cool winds of October blow and Halloween approaches. I work in an old building and start early. With daylight savings time, it's dark when I arrive at work. As I get to work, I open the heavy metal door at the entrance. The sound echoes ominously through the empty halls. The door creaked as I opened it. I passed empty cubicles shrouded in shadows. If you let yourself think about it, it can be downright terrifying. I remember a hallway conversation I overheard the week before. 2 employees were whispering, one recounting how a team member had heard an eerie whistling near my cubicle. He went to investigate and saw a shadow dart across the hall. That haunting tale unsettled me. Knowing it happened right where I work, I tried to push it out of my head, reminding myself that I hadn't experienced any ghostly encounters there. But then I remembered my early days with the company. I was assigned to a different, older building with small windows from which you could see the ocean waves. My cubicle was nestled deep within the room, like a maze leading to a hidden lair. It was there that I encountered the tapping ghost. It would loudly tap on my desk as if demanding my attention. At first I thought it was my manager who needed something and was trying to get my attention, but after several instances of that happening and nothing being there, I realized it was something else. And I was eventually transferred to another location where I encountered no such phenomena, leaving those experiences behind. Sometimes I wonder if my old cubicle still echoes with those ghostly taps. Now my thoughts drift back to the present. I turn the lights on and put my backpack on my desk, feeling a sense of relief. I'm glad that nothing has happened where I currently work. I think to myself. I head to the restroom, and as I open the door, I heard an unsettling noise. I assumed someone else was inside, but when I entered, I found a sink running full blast. I looked around and realized I was alone. I turned off the faucet, and in my mind, speak to whatever presence was lingering. I acknowledge you, and I see you are here. Perhaps I have a ghostly encounter in this new place after all. How fitting for Halloween. And that was from Bob in the U.S. And I kind of recounted what he said in that second to the last paragraph. But that was the way he sent it in, so I just read it. And thanks for the stories, Bob. The next story is another one from the old days, and it's from 1920 in Greensburg, Pennsylvania. Residents of Carbon, a mining village a mile southwest of here, are greatly exercised over the weird flittings about late at night of what is declared to be a ghost, clad in a snow-white gown. This ghost, is said, has on 3 different occasions, between midnight and 1, aroused Peter Olesen, a Norwegian miner who lives in a small house with its strange wrappings on his door, more vigorous than those of Poe's raven. Olesen arose promptly on each occasion, and when he opened his front door, the figure of what he believed was a young woman in a white robe stood on his step. "What do you want? Come into my house. I won't hurt you," Olesen declares he told the strange figure. But he failed to get an answer, and when he would attempt to lay hands on the ghost would give a shrill cry and disappear. On 3 succeeding nights, the hobgoblin appeared at the Olsen home, and 3 times did the snow-white figure refuse the Norwegian's invitation to come into his house and to give him an account of its mysterious presence. Frank Pizzo, an Italian neighbor, was also called to his door in response to the woman in white wrapping. Frank's experience was similar to those of Olesen. William Mahler's Carbon Grocery for many years and a local ghost authority says the nocturnal visitor in the white dress is the ghost of a very pretty young woman captured by the Indians in their flight from eastern Pennsylvania many years ago. And that was a ghost story from 1920, and it took place in Carbon, Pennsylvania. which was a small mining town. And the next story is from Tyler in Durham, North Carolina. The Haunted Governor's Mansion. Hi, Lex. Hopefully this gets to you in time for the Halloween Mega-Macabre episode. I don't have any personal paranormal experiences to report, at least not yet. But I do have a local ghost legend story here in North Carolina's capital area, which I thought you and your listeners may enjoy. Officially called the North Carolina Executive Mansion, the impressive and imposing governor's residence was constructed from 1883 to 1891 on Blount Street near downtown Raleigh's historic Burke Square. It features an impressive and imposing edifice of Victorian and Queen Anne architecture, angular eaves, high brick windows, and gables bearing pairs of windows suggestive of unblinking, rectangular eyes. It's every bit the type of place location scouts for a haunted house movie would drool over. Built almost entirely of locally sourced building materials, including North Carolina clay bricks molded by prison labor, some of which are inscribed with workers' names and initials still visible today. Granite sourced from the southern Appalachians, its most famous feature is perhaps the grand staircase of North Carolina walnut, connecting the layers of its infamous domicile for North Carolina's top elected officials and their families, most of whom have left the mansion with some unsettling stories to tell. When Governor Bob Scott and his wife moved into the building in 1970, they decided to remove the bed of the first governor to live in the executive mansion, Daniel Fowle, from the Daniel Fowle bedroom, replacing it with a longer bed that fit Governor Scott's tall stature. Fowle had died in the mansion on April 7, 1891, in that original bed, only 3 months into his term. After moving Fowle's bed, the Scotts repeatedly experienced knocking on the wall behind their new bed at around 10 p.m. These would invariably come in a sequence of 3. Scott initially assumed the noise was old pipes, but subsequent investigation by the maintenance crew found no pipes ran behind the wall. Despite claiming not to believe in ghosts, Governor Scott came to wonder if it was Fowle expressing his displeasure with the deathbed being moved from the room that bears his name, even referring to the noises as Governor Fowle's ghost during a press conference. According to historians, Fowle, perhaps sensing that his departure from this life was imminent, summoned his children to gather around that bed. To do so, he pressed a call button on the wall behind the bed, the same wall from which the knocking would later emanate. When depressed, that call button would make 3 loud, distinct clicks. The bed was eventually returned to the Governor Fowle room, at which time the noises reportedly ceased. That is, until 1993, when Governor Jim Hunt claimed they had returned. In many states, it is traditional for incoming governors to remove displayed portraits of former governors from the other party, whichever that may be, prior to the new governor moving in. This is not done at the North Carolina Executive Mansion, supposedly to avoid angering any potential lingering spirits of past residents. It's the type of superstition that proves ghosts don't have to be real in physical sense to direct the behavior of the living. Governor Jim Martin, who served from the mid-1980s to the early 1990s, reported various strange and seemingly inexplicable occurrences in the house. Though he stated that he didn't necessarily believe in ghosts, he would bid them good night every evening, just in case. Once, while checking a room on the third floor, a state trooper claimed he experienced a phantom gust of wind that slammed the door shut behind him. The door then reopened almost immediately, also without any discernible cause. Shaken, the trooper fled the floor immediately. Further allegations of strange noises include unidentified noises, cold spots, unaccountable gusts of wind, doors opening and closing by themselves, reported by the staff and guests alike. Some even claim to have witnessed spectral figures through the windows, pacing the halls of the second floor. Today, the mansion is included in local ghost tours. The Wahl evidence remains anecdotal, of course. The governor's mansion is a hot spot in North Carolina folklore, and, perhaps in more ways than one, it is a place where history lives on, where past and present interact and overlap. Perhaps, especially, on some dark nights, the line between them blurs just enough for someone or something to sneak through. Thanks for doing what you do, Lex, and thanks to everyone who contributes to making this fun, intriguing, and deliciously creepy show a must-listen for insatiable horror fanatics like me. Happy Halloween. Okay, and thank you, Tyler, for putting that together. That was wonderful. Okay, and so that's all I have for news stories, and I know I'm going to have a lot of new listeners for the Halloween season. So I thought I'd treat you to a story that was very popular when it came out. It kind of astonished me, the amount of email I got regarding the story. But it's still a gem, and it's from Laura in San Francisco, and it's a haunted apartment.
Here goes. My name is Laura, and I'm from San Francisco. In 1997, I was living in Ithaca, New York, where my mother and my two half-brothers live. I had been living with a good friend in a two-bedroom apartment, but our schedules didn't really overlap. In mid-September, I decided to find a new place to live. I wasn't making much money at the time, so I decided to move into a very small efficiency studio on the edge of town. It was in a large apartment complex that was probably built in the 1980s. It was new, pretty shoddy construction, essentially built as low-income housing. My apartment was on the ground floor. It was basically one large room with a small bathroom and small closet-style kitchenette off to one side. At the back of the room was a large closet with sliding mirror doors on it. It wasn't great, but the price was right. I moved in on October 1st, 1997. At first, I really liked having my own space. I had been living with my roommates for so long that I really enjoyed coming home to the solitude and the fact that there was no mess or dirty dishes because I'm sort of a neat freak. The only downsides to the apartment, which I noticed right away, were that when I came home after work every day and walked in the door, when the room had been shut up all day, there was a faintly sick, sweet odor. It was like rotting leaves or garbage. Since I'm a very clean person, this frustrated me. I knew there was no garbage and that all the surfaces were clean. I would open the windows and I burned scented candles, which dispelled the smell temporarily, but whenever I came home after being away for a few hours, it was back again. The other thing about the apartment that became more and more of a problem as October gave way to November was that it was very, very cold. I chalked this up to the fact that it was a cheaply built building. It had poor or no insulation, and the carpet was just this thin indoor-outdoor type. The thing was, even in November, when the temperatures were beginning to fall, it was often warmer outside than it was in my apartment. I decided that this was because a bad designer had placed the electric heating unit along the wall under the only window in the apartment, which meant that all the heat was being sucked right out of the insulated window. This is where the story gets difficult to tell and why I've had to work up the courage to tell it. As maybe many of your listeners know, paranormal events seem to happen at times when you're particularly sensitive to them. Between November and December, I began to feel more and more depressed and became more reclusive. This is not like me. I'm pretty outgoing. Though I do enjoy my solitude and my time alone, I like to read and write a lot. Family and friends have always been important to me. But during mid-November of that year, I began to feel a crushing depression. The thing is, I had a history of depression. When I was 15, I had tried to take my own life, and I had been in therapy for many years after that. When my mood and thoughts began to turn darker and more filled with despair, I really thought I was just experiencing another round of a cycle of depression. I knew that eventually it would pass, so I just tried to buckle down and endure this round of it. Around the end of November, beginning of December, a couple of things happened that did not seem strange at the time, but later made a lot of sense. First of all, I had been getting a lot of junk mail, but somehow the companies that were sending me the mail had got my name wrong. The first name and middle initial were correct, and the first part of the last name was right, but the last name was slightly different than mine. I thought that somehow I must have ended up on one of those mass marketing lists somewhere, and they had just typed my name in wrong. The mailboxes for the whole apartment building were on this island in the middle of the parking lot out front. Whenever I walked out there to get my mail, I would wave to this perpetual group of teenagers that hung out in front of the building, gossiping and smoking. I remember thinking what jerks they were, because whenever I came out there, they got quiet and seemed to be waiting for me to leave. When I left, I'd hear them start whispering to each other. But teenagers are teenagers. I just shrugged it off. But it definitely added to this atmosphere of depression and isolation that was weighing more and more heavily on me. A similar thing with the junk mail was happening with telemarketers calling on my phone. This was before the federal no-call list, and at least twice a week I was getting calls for someone with my same first name but a slightly different last name. The first 2 weeks of December, things got worse. My mother and I had had a falling out and she wasn't speaking to me. I think it was over some advice I had given my oldest half-brother and that she had taken issue with. I spent all my free time alone in my apartment, lying in bed and reading. I didn't have a TV. It was so cold that I used an electric blanket for heat, which worked better and cost a lot less than the electric heat in my apartment. I was very down over the fight with my mother, but I didn't want to talk to anyone about it. When my friends came by, I ignored their knocks and pretended I wasn't home. I didn't answer the phone, and I didn't return anyone's calls if they left a message on my machine. That was when I had the first dream, if you can call it that. Even now, comparing it to all the dreams I've had in my life, it's definitely different. I was awake, but I was in that state between awake and asleep where you're still aware of your surroundings but aren't completely alert. That was when I heard a woman say to me, "I need your help." I thought to myself, I am dreaming. So I thought back at her, "Why do you need my help?" She answered, "I'm stuck here and I can't get out." I remember feeling very, very cold and the most intense kind of black unhappiness I had ever felt in my life. It was the bleakest sensation of being utterly alone and utterly devastated. I thought in my head to her again, "But how can I help you?" She answered, "I need you to carry me. I need to attach myself to you so that you can carry me out of this place. I can't do it on my own." Even in the half-dreaming state I was in, what she said scared the heck out of me. I knew in some part of myself that it would be very bad to say yes to her, But another part of me believed that all of this was just my own imagination and part of my own depression, that I was slipping so far down this time that maybe another part of myself was appealing to me for help, that maybe I was just carrying on a conversation with my own psyche. That was when I decided that I would say yes, because I wanted to help myself. I thought back to the voice, "All right, you can do it. I will help you." I slept through that night. When I woke up the next morning, it was snowing. I felt a strange sense of not being really connected to myself, like I was watching myself get up and make coffee, wash my face, etc. I think it was a Sunday. I remember I didn't have to go to work that day. And this is when the story gets really strange and frightens me even now. For some reason, after I drank my morning coffee, I went into my closet and got out a pile of clean white sheets. I had about 5 or 6 of them. Standing on a chair, I tacked them to the ceiling with push pins so that they hung down around my room, sort of like artificial walls made out of white sheets. I put them up at right angles to each other so that they formed a kind of tunnel that went from my bed to the front door. Even now, I have no idea what possessed me to do this. It is so completely weird that it's embarrassing to admit even now. After I had tacked up the sheets, I crawled into my bed with a box of cookies. I knew then that I was going to kill myself. The idea just came to me all of a sudden as if it were the obvious solution or just a very simple thing that I needed to do. Just then, my phone rang and the answering machine picked up. It was my mother. She said, "Honey, please call me. I'm sorry. I'm worried about you." I sat and looked at the phone for a long time, and then I picked it up, and then I put it back down. I got up and got the phone book, and I looked up a suicide prevention hotline, and I called. I talked to the woman on the other end for about an hour. I didn't tell her about any of the weird things that had happened. I really thought that I was losing it, that I had gone crazy. I just wanted to hear the sound of a voice that was not judging me, somebody who didn't know me. After she talked to me for about an hour, she gave me the number of a local sliding scale counseling center and made me give her my word that I would call them as soon as I hung up with her. I did. I made an appointment to see someone the next day. The rest of that day was really difficult for me. I tried to distract myself by cleaning the apartment. While doing so, I discovered something that really scared me. All along the edges of the windows and on parts of the mirrored closet door, I discovered a kind of black mold that had begun to grow. I thought at first it was just discolorations on the mirror or in the wood that framed the windows, but when I looked closer, I realized they had this circular, spattered pattern of mold. I had a degree in biology, so I knew that it was mold, but I had never seen this kind before. I went to the counseling session the next day, and the woman I spoke to told me that she wanted to work with me twice a week for as long as we needed. I began to talk to her about a lot of secrets and deep troubles that I had been carrying around with me for years. I was put on antidepressant medication. Within a few weeks, I was starting to feel better. The atmosphere in my apartment was still bad. I still noticed the smell, but I took down the weird sheets and started spending more time with my friends. My mom and I patched things up. I began to believe that all of the strange events, my strange behavior, and my experience with the woman's voice who asked me to help her had been symptoms of my depression. I was slowly rising back out of the paralysis I had felt. In January, I was on my way across the parking lot toward my apartment one afternoon when the property manager, who was standing on her balcony on the second floor, called out to me and waved me over. We introduced ourselves to each other, and when I told her my name, she looked startled. She asked me a few questions about whether or not I was happy with the apartment or not. I told her it was okay, but it was cold and a little bit lonely. She said, "Can I ask you a more personal question?" I felt a little strange, but I thought, why not? "Yes," I said. She said, "Do you notice anything strange about your apartment, like a funny smell or anything like that?" I have to say that at that moment I felt that strange feeling when the hair on the back of your neck stands up. I knew that she was about to tell me something that I both wanted and did not want to know. I told her yes, that I did sometimes notice a funny smell, but that I kept things very clean and burned candles and that it wasn't too bad. Just when I first got home was when I really noticed it. "That's good," she said. "You just let me know if you need anything." Then she asked me my name again. I told her, and she said something like, "That's what I thought you said, but I thought I didn't hear you right." I knew there was something the woman wasn't telling me. For the next month, in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about that interaction. I decided that if I ran into her again, I would ask her for more details. On Valentine's Day that year, my dad and stepmother, who live in California, sent me a flower bouquet. They knew I didn't have a boyfriend, and they were just being sweet because they knew I had been down. Since it came in the middle of the day when I was at work, it was delivered to my upstairs neighbors, whom I had never met. Shortly after I came home, there was a knock on my front door. When I answered it, there was a man in his 40s standing there, holding the bouquet of flowers in a vase. "Are you Laura?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He gave me the strangest look and then said, "These came for you today." I took the flowers, but when I went to thank him, he turned away and almost bolted up the stairs. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. It was either the next day or a couple of days later that I was leaving my apartment when a little girl who lived in the apartment complex was riding by my door on her big wheel. Since my door was open, she stopped and looked inside. She was about 5 or 6 years old. "Hi," I said, "you can come in if you want." She seemed very curious about the inside of my apartment, but she shook her head and started backing away from the door, pushing with her feet to move her big wheel backward. I went outside and was locking my door behind me, and she was still sitting there on her big wheel. She said, "Did you know the lady that died?" I said, "What?" She said, "The lady that died," and pointed at my apartment. "A lady died there?" I said. She nodded. I squatted down so that I was at eye level with her. "When did this happen?" I said, but she didn't answer. She looked pretty scared. "That's okay," I said. "Bye-bye, I'll see you later." I went directly upstairs and knocked on the property manager's door. "Look," I said, "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to ask you a question." She looked at me like she knew what I was going to say. "A little girl just told me that a woman died in my apartment. Is that true?" She looked at me for a few seconds and then she nodded. "I didn't want to say anything to you," she said. "The rental agency said that I shouldn't say anything." "What happened?" I said. "She committed suicide," she answered. "When?" I asked. "The day after Princess Diana died. I guess she was a huge fan of Princess Diana, and they think her death had something to do with it. Princess Diana died on August 31st, 2007, which was exactly a month before I moved in." The woman went on to tell me that the woman who committed suicide in my apartment was a recluse. She almost never came out of her apartment except to go shopping or when she had to. So they didn't find her body at first. It was my upstairs neighbors that started to notice a bad smell about 2 weeks later, and that's when they opened it up and found her. The woman told me the following. She said it was really bad. She had been decomposing for 2 weeks, and it was the weirdest thing I've ever seen. There was this black mold growing all over everything, the walls and the mirrors. They had to throw everything of hers away because it was covered with black mold. Honestly, I was feeling right then the way you probably feel right now listening to this. There is no way this could really be true. I had to have been making this up, but I'm not. Still, some part of me then, even with everything I had been through, didn't believe her. So here's what I did. I went to the Tompkins County Library and looked up the obituaries on microfiche for September of 1997, and I found her obituary. She was a writer from California. I'm from California, and I'm a writer. She was 20 years older than me, and her first name, middle, and last initial were the same as mine. With a photocopy of the obituary in my hand, I went to the rental agent's office. I asked her if it was true, and she admitted that it was. I asked her why or how she could possibly, in good conscience, have rented an apartment to me when I had almost exactly the same name as the woman who had committed suicide in the apartment only a month before I moved in. She didn't have a good answer, but she was very apologetic and offered to let me move into a different unit right next door. I did, but 1 month later I moved out of the apartment complex entirely. I didn't feel like a single wall between the two apartments was enough to really make any difference. I still don't really understand what happened to me. The circumstances of what happened were so intimately tied up in my own mental state and life that it's impossible for me to believe that this could really have happened to anyone else. It was as if I was meant to move into that apartment. But I'm not a person who simply believes things. The facts have to support the feelings. In this case, the facts are what made what I thought was a severe bout with depression into something I have no other way to describe as also paranormal. I realize this is a very long story. I hope you can share it with your listeners. If you have any doubt as to its truthfulness, I have a copy of Laura's obituary, and I'm happy to scan it and send it to you. Thanks, Lex, and keep up with the podcast. It's great.
This is Garrett Husbeth,
Brent Dolan,
and Al Robber
of the Haunted New Jersey podcast.
Hey, Al, what are you listening to?
I'm listening to Lex Wall's Anything Ghost podcast.
Do what we do at Haunted New Jersey and listen to Lex Wall's Anything Ghost podcast for spine-tingling tales of the paranormal from everyday people around the globe.
All right, and this is and that'll do it for the Anything Ghost Mega-Macabre Halloween special of 2024. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope you have a really safe and really spooky Halloween. Until the next episode of Anything Ghost, that'll be episode number 316. Happy Halloween, and take care.